Yeah, I think we have enough. We can start. So can you move to the next slide, please? You're invited to participate in our transportation planning process, regardless of your race, color, national origin, including limited English proficiency, religion, creed, gender, ancestry, ethnicity, disability, age, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity or expression, veteran status, or background. You can read the full notice of your rights and protections at www.boston.org/MPO_NON_DISCRIMINATION. Excuse me. All participants will join the meeting with muted microphones. Please rename yourself to include your first name, last name, and affiliation if you have one. After roll call, board members may mute and unmute themselves. Always remain muted unless actively speaking. To participate in the discussion, please select the raise hand function. Find this by clicking either on the participants button at the bottom of the screen, and a window will pop up with a raise hand button at the bottom, or the reactions button in the toolbar. The chair will then call on participants. If you're on the phone, you can use *9 to raise your hand. If you have any technical difficulties, please contact Betsy Harvey via the chat box at eharvey@ctps.org or call her at 857-702-3701. This meeting is accessible to people with disabilities. Zoom products are compliant with exceptions with the following standards: Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.1 Level AA standards and revised Section 508 standards. If you require any additional accommodations in order to participate fully in this meeting, please contact Betsy Harvey, the MPO staff, at eharvey@ctps.org or call her at 857-702-3701. First item on the agenda is introductions. Judy, can you call the roll, please?
Yes, Mass DOT Chair.
This is David Moeller representing Secretary Jamie Tesler.
Mass DOT Seat 2.
This is John Bouchard representing Highway Administrator Jonathan Gulliver.
Thank you. Mass DOT Highway.
Not seeing John Romano yet.
Got it. MBTA.
Good morning. This is Laura Gilmore for the MBTA.
We heard from Massport that they won't be attending, so I'll move on ahead to MAPC.
Good morning, Eric Barassa with the Metropolitan Area Planning Council.
Thank you. MBTA Advisory Board.
I'm not seeing Amira Patterson yet.
Regional Transportation Advisory Council.
Sorry about that. This is Leonard Diggins representing the Advisory Council. Thank you.
Thanks. City of Boston, Boston Transportation Department.
William Conroy representing Mayor Wu in the City of Boston.
City of Boston BPDA.
Hey, Jim Fitzgerald with DPDA representing Mayor Wu in City of Boston.
At-large City, City of Everett.
Jay Monty representing Mayor DeMaria in the City of Everett.
At-large City, City of Newton.
David Kozas representing Mayor Ruth Ann Fuller in the City of Newton.
At-large Town, Town of Arlington.
I'm not seeing Daniel Amstutz at the moment.
At-large Town, Town of Brooklyn.
Daniel is no longer an MPO member. If anyone does come, it should be Claire Ricker.
Thank you. I'm not seeing a Claire Ricker.
Okay. At-large Town, Town of Brookline.
Heather Hamilton for the Town of Brookline.
Thank you. Intercore Committee, City of Somerville.
Good morning, Tom Bent, City of Somerville, representing Mayor Katiana Ballantyne in the Inner Core.
Thank you. Minuteman Advisory Group on Interlocal Coordination, Town of Acton.
Boston Region Town of Acton, representing the Magic Subregion.
Metro West Regional Collaborative, City of Framingham.
Dennis Giambetti, representing Mayor Sinsky and the Metro West region.
North Shore Task Force, City of Beverly. Heard from Darlene that she might not be coming, so I'll skip that for now. North Suburban Planning Council, Town of Burlington.
Melissa with North Suburban Planning Council.
All right, South Shore Coalition, Town of Hull.
I'm not seeing Jen Constable at the moment.
Southwest Advisory Planning Committee, Town of Medway.
Not seeing Peter Pelletier.
Right. Three Rivers Interlocal Council, Town of Norwood, Neponset River Regional Chamber.
Good morning, Tom O'Rourke from the town of Norwood, representing the Trick subregion.
All right, our ex officio members, Federal Highway Administration.
Not seeing Cassie Ostrander or Ken Miller.
Okay. And Federal Transit Administration.
I'm not seeing Leah Sermon.
All right, I see John Romano, if we want to go back to Mass DOT Highway.
Yeah, of course.
John Romano here.
All right, thank you.
I think I saw Amir Patterson enter as well too.
Okay, MBTA Advisory Board.
Yes, good morning. Amira Patterson, representing the MBTA Advisory Board. Good morning, everyone.
Thank you.
And then Chris Timble from FHWA is here if you want to unmute his microphone so he can say present.
Yes, Chris Timble, representing Federal Highway.
All right, thank you.
So that's everybody. Thank you all. Next item on the agenda is Chair's Report. I do not have one, so we'll go directly to Tegan, Executive Director's Report.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I do have a number of items today, so please bear with me. If we could go to the first slide, Logan, that would be great. So first, I have a few updates that I'm categorizing as general project updates. The first one is relatively brief. If you may recall, those of you who have been on the board for a little while, we have a policy on the board that UPWP funded study, the total project budget up to 10% can be dedicated to doing groundwork that we need to do as staff to develop a more refined work scope before we then present it to the board. So as the first bullet point indicates, we are keeping you informed that for the lab and municipal parking study, we are employing that policy and doing some background research to develop methodology that will be feasible and meet the objectives of the board that will then inform that scope of work. So we will be doing that, again, that kind of early work, and then we will be coming to the board with a scope, and we will be clear about how much of the project budget has been expended before getting your approval on the full scope of work. The second item on my project updates has to do with giving updates on the development of our next long-range transportation plan, which is one of the most important and central processes that we engage in as an MPO. So I want to keep you updated as to where we are in this process. Right now, we are gathering input to inform updates to the MPO's vision and goals that are included in the long-range plan and the investment priorities. So what we are doing is we are currently synthesizing data that we've collected and input related to transportation needs and using those to formulate ideas for updates to the goals and objectives included in the long range plan. And we are also shaping those ideas by feedback we've heard from MPO members and the Regional Transportation Advisory Council throughout this past summer and this fall. And then also I want to highlight that we're in the process of meeting with our planning partners at the MBTA, the RTAs, MEPC, and others to figure out some ways in which we may want to talk about adjusting the investment programs. And then finally, we have been reviewing the previous universe of projects for the long range plan and getting project updates. And later in the meeting, you'll hear a little bit more about how the TIP universe of projects and the LRTP universe are related to each other and how that information is being shared. So the third item on this list is an update for you all on the Safe Streets and Roads for All grant application. Just as a very brief recap, hopefully you all recall that we discussed the intent to apply and the board voted to approve the application of a regional proposal to this discretionary grant program from the federal government. We discussed it at 2 MPO board meetings. And then we also had a number of meetings that we hoped targeted most of the key stakeholders that would be engaged in the development of a regional safety action plan the best we could in the time we had. And that included talking about it at an Intercorps Committee sub-regional meeting, talking with the Massachusetts Vision Zero Coalition, and the Regional Transportation Advisory Council meeting. So we spoke also directly with about a dozen municipalities on this board and not on this board who were thinking about applying themselves. And we talked about them in advance. And as we all kind of worked together to develop this regional approach that would be inclusive of all municipalities in the region. So we submitted our application, and then we were informed not that long ago, a few weeks ago, about 4 what the federal government calls duplicative applications, which means that 4 municipalities within the Boston region did actually submit applications for creating those safety action plans for those individual municipalities. So we needed to have some conversations about what that meant, since there is a preference from the federal government not to have duplicative applications. So we met with our federal partners, we met with the municipalities and the representatives, both separately and together, and considered 2 options that were proposed by the federal representatives for us to consider together. Those were to essentially keep the proposals as is, as separate but duplicative applications, or to become a single joint application. And in particular, our federal partners emphasized an approach to kind of absorbing the 4 applications and then creating sort of a pass-through structure to those applications, to those municipalities who applied. So we acknowledged right away that that approach, that sort of joint application approach, is not consistent with the process that led to this regional application, and that we understand that, we couldn't reach everyone in our initial outreach with all the cities and towns. And so we did, miss some, and it's unfortunate that we have duplicate applications. And we also wanted to acknowledge that we also heard from many of you all in these meetings and otherwise that there were questions and concerns around how a regional process would really be able to work to enable local municipal applications for implementation. So we hear those concerns, and we really took those into account in our application, and we're going to continue to work with you all and our federal partners so that the regional process that we've applied for is going to be successful in terms of enabling municipalities to apply for those next steps of implementation funds. And so we considered a few options, but in the end, what I want to highlight for the board is that we are moving forward with the proposal as you originally proposed and voted on and approved, which is that we would still pursue the regional application. But in that, we are also committed to continuing to work with both the 4 municipalities who did submit applications, as well as everybody else in the region, to ensure that we are creating a plan that meets the needs across the region. So that's my update, and I'm happy. I see a hand up, Mr. Chair. I don't know if you would like me to pause, and I can always answer any particular questions about this if you'd like, or I can keep going.
That's up to you. Do you want to take questions as you
I think
go, or wait to the end?
I think it makes sense to pause here and take any questions on these 3 items.
Okay, Bill Conroy. Bill, I think you're going to mute yourself, I think.
Tegan, who were the municipalities?
Yeah, absolutely. So it was Weymouth, Sharon, Salem, and Dedham.
Okay. Thanks. And so, so I guess just going forward, did they give you a timeline after kind of this part is resolved when, I guess, like they would be funding your application as kind of the regional organization?
Yeah, actually, if I could defer to Rebecca Morgan, who's the MPO staff who's been leading this application process from our side. We've been partnering with MAPC, but she might be able to talk about any updates to the timeline for when we hear about the award and next steps. Rebecca, do you have a sense of that that deadline?
Yes, thanks, Tegan. What we heard from USDOT is that they're planning on making decisions in December, January timeframe. So we should be hearing kind of early winter. that's why there's kind of a quick turnaround in us getting back about these duplicative applications, because they're looking to really make a decision, hopefully by the end of the calendar year, but I think that they're saying kind of latest, probably January.
Any other questions?
Thanks.
Seeing none. Megan?
Okay, so let's go to the next slide. And I will provide just a few updates around our engagement activities. You often hear me talk about the transit working group meetings that we have, because those are ongoing on a pretty regular basis. We did host another coffee chat for the transit working group yesterday that focused on informing the development of our long-range transportation plan, which I've already mentioned today, and also the updated coordinated human services transportation public transit plan. So again, you can always reach out to staff, to Sandy Johnston, if you're interested in learning more about those conversations, and please keep an eye out for future coffee chats that will continue and be upcoming. In addition, I've been giving you highlights that we have been meeting with the sub-regional groups defined by MAPC's process to discuss the planning process, the long-range plan, and regional sub-regional transportation priorities. So we've met with 5 of the 8 so far, and we will be meeting next with North Suburban Planning Council in December, on December 13th, and we're working out dates for the Southwest Advisory Planning Committee and Metro West Regional Collaborative. So if you are interested in more information about those, you can contact Stella Jordan, who's our Public Engagement Program Manager, for more information. And again, if they're being held in your region, please, or your sub-region, please do participate, and invite others to participate as appropriate. Next on our list is that we will be having some tip how-to meetings. We've actually had some, and we'll have some more coming up. This past Tuesday, we hosted a how-to session for how municipal stakeholders can take part in the tip development, as well as getting funding for projects. And so we will also hold a second session later this afternoon at 2 p.m. So if you're interested, please attend, or encourage others to attend. And then lastly, back to the long-range transportation plan, specifically wanted to highlight a virtual meeting coming up. It's being hosted by the 495 Metro West Partnership, and it's coming up on Wednesday, November 30th. So if you're interested in participating in that conversation about the LRTP, please do so. And finally, we're putting final touches on a wide release survey to collect feedback on what I mentioned before, which is the MPO's any updates to the visions and goals and the investment program. So please keep an eye out for that survey coming your way. And then with that, we can go to the next slide, today's agenda items. We have a few action items involving a TIP amendment and also a UPWP adjustment. And I will let staff give you the highlights of those. We'll be asking you to endorse those today. And then we will have 3 presentations. We will be talking about the federal fiscal year 24 to 28 TIP universe of projects. And then we'll have 2 excellent presentations on study work that staff has done. One is addressing equity and access in the Blue Hills, and the other is about a memorandum related to the MPO freight program about looking at priority treatments for both transit and freight in the same locations. And then finally, as a reminder, the next meeting will be on, the next slide, please, December 1st. And we will have some work scopes to be approved and likely a few presentations. And as a reminder, as usual, it will be preceded by an A&F committee meeting where we will talk about elements of the MPO's operations plan. That, Mr. Chair, is it.
Thank you. Tegan, any questions for Tegan? Seeing none. Next item on the agenda is public comments. Is there anyone from the public who would like to comment at this time? Seeing and hearing none, if you want to comment during the meeting, please raise your hand and we will call on you. Committee chairs reports. Are there any? I thought UPWP met, but maybe they didn't. All right, Regional Transportation Advisory Council report.
No, thanks, Mr. Chair. Actually, it was Administration and Finance that met, but I'll let Mr. Kane speak for his committee whenever he can. So yes, the advisory council met. Was it last week? Yeah, it was last week. And we had Tegan, who talked with us, about other MPOs, both in state and out of state. There's a little bit of a view of the visit from the Miami-Dade cluster of MPOs, and so it was very informative from the perspective of what others are doing, and it gave us some ideas of well, Steve's desire to continue that kind of outreach and understanding of other MPOs, and certainly gave us the motivation to reach out to other advisory councils in state. So we'll pursue that. And the other thing that happened is that I was elected to my fourth term, and it's a real honor to be elected again. And Franny Osmond is going to be the vice chair this year. And this is going to be, my plan is for this to be my last year. And it's not because I am tired of this. In fact, it's the opposite. I mean, I feel I really love being a part of this board. I'm learning a lot, but I do think it's a good idea to let someone else have the fun, and learn from this. Even though I think it's really great that we have lots of institutional knowledge here. I mean, I think it's also good that there are elements that can rotate around, to just increase the types of voices that you get. But I'm not be going anywhere. I'm going to be staying with the advisory council, and if nothing else, I'll be joining Steve all enough at these meetings in the peanut gallery. So you'll be hearing from me. So thank you.
Thank you, Lynn. Any questions for Lynn? Seeing none, Derek Carlat.
Thank you, and apologies for I had lost track of time, but the committee chair reports, we did meet on November 3rd after the last MPO meeting and just mixed up the dates. So the UPWP committee did endorse or recommended for endorsement the proposed adjustment that will be presented later on in this agenda for the federal fiscal year 2023 Unified Planning Work Program, just proposing to increase the amount allocated to MAPC within the 2023 UPWP. So thank you.
Thank you, Derek. Next item is an action item for the approval of the MPO minutes of October 6th. Can I get a motion and a second from a member? And please state your name for the record when making a motion. Eric Barassa.
Eric Barassa with MAPC. I'll make a motion to approve the October 6th MPO minutes.
Is there a second? Tom Bent.
I'll second that motion.
Thank you. Motion has been made and seconded. Are there any comments, changes, questions, or suggestions? Seeing and hearing none. Judy, please call the roll.
Great. David Moeller,
Yes.
John Bouchard,
John Bouchard, yes.
John Romano,
John Romano, yes.
Laura Gilmore,
Laura Gilmore, yes.
Eric Barassa,
Eric Barassa, yes.
Amira Patterson,
Amira Patterson, yes.
Leonard Diggins,
Leonard Diggins, yes.
Bill Conroy,
Bill Conroy, yes.
Jim Fitzgerald,
Jim Fitzgerald, yes.
Jay Monty,
Jay Monty, yes.
David Kozis,
David Kozis, yes.
Heather Hamilton,
Heather Hamilton, yes.
Tom Bent,
Tom Bennett, yes.
Austin Siganowitz,
Austin Siganowitz, yes.
Dennis Giambetti,
Dennis Giambetti, yes.
Melissa Tentakoulis,
Melissa Tintakos, yes.
and Tom O'Rourke.
Tom O'Rourke, yes.
Great. That calls the roll, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Judy. Next item is the federal fiscal year 2023-2027 tip amendment number 1. Ethan.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning, everybody. My name is Ethan Lapointe. This morning, I'd like to start with a presentation on Amendment 1 to the Transportation Improvement Program for federal years 2023 to 2027. If we could go on to the next slide, please. Oh, I didn't realize I didn't have a slide deck. So the 2023 to 2027 tip Amendment 1, as discussed at a previous MPO board meeting in November, is based off of the tip that was approved October 12th, 2022, and proposed carry forward of the MBTA's Section 5307 and section 5337 funding from federal fiscal year 2022 into 2023. For a refresher, that section 5307 and 5337 funding is for state of good repair, fleet procurement, maintenance of existing rolling stock, and other MBTA capital uses. This also included the carry forward of federal discretionary grant awards, including Rebuilding American Infrastructure with Sustainability and Equity, or RAISE grants, for both Blue Hill Avenue and the recently awarded Linway Multimodal Corridor, and also a Commuter Authority Rail Safety Improvement Grant. This also included a low no emissions bus grant for an electric bus program that the MBTA advanced. Next slide, please. Given that these changes constitute an amendment, a public comment period was opened on October 21st, 2022, and concluded on November 10th. Staff received 3 comments regarding Amendment 1 during this public comment period. One was with regard to supporting the Linway Multimodal Corridor project. The second was a question that MPO staff received and responded to regarding the low no emissions grant that the MBTA received and where that funding was derived from the Federal Transit Administration grant program and how it was being allocated to the battery electric bus project for the MBTA. The third was a question via social media that came in to MPO staff regarding where members of the public could find explanations for amendment changes and other materials, which could be located on the MPO website and on the calendar in some of the supplementary tables included within not only this meeting invite, but that are also posted there for this amendment and all other amendments. Next slide, please. So given all of this, if there are no further questions on Amendment 1, staff are requesting that the MPO vote to approve Amendment 1 and endorse it for inclusion into the federal fiscal years 2023 to 2027 TIP. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Ethan. Any questions of Ethan? Seeing none, can I get a motion and a second to approve the amendment as presented today? And please state your name for the record when making the motion. Eric Barassa.
Eric Barassa, I will make the motion to approve the amendment 1 to the TIP.
Thank you. Lynn Diggins.
Leonard Diggins, Advisory Council, seconds.
Thank you. Motion having been made and seconded. Judy, please call the roll.
Right, David Muller,
Yes.
John Bouchard,
John Bouchard, yes.
John Romano,
John Romano, yes.
Laura Gilmore,
Laura Gilmore, yes.
Eric Barassa,
Eric Barassa, yes.
Amira Patterson,
Amira Patterson, yes.
Leonard Diggins,
Leonard Diggins, yes.
Bill Conroy,
Bill Conroy, yes.
Jim Fitzgerald,
Jim Fitzgerald, yes.
Jay Monty,
Jay Monty, yes.
David Kozis,
David Kozis, yes.
Heather Hamilton,
Heather Hamilton, yes.
Tom Bent,
Tom Bent, yes.
Austin Siganowitz,
Austin Siganowicz, yes.
Dennis Giambetti,
Dennis Giambetti, yes.
Melissa Tintopolis,
Melissa Tintopolis, yes.
and Tom O'Rourke.
Tom O'Rourke, yes.
That calls the roll.
Thank you. Next item on the agenda is Unified Planning Work Program Adjustment Number 1. Srilekha.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good morning, everyone. My name is Srilekha Murthy, and today I will be presenting the federal fiscal year 2023 Unified Planning Work Program Adjustment 1. At the end of this presentation, I will request that this board vote to endorse this adjustment. Next slide, please, Logan. We are presenting an adjustment rather than an amendment because each line item increase is under 25%. This adjustment focuses on increases to MAPC's tasks in the UPWP. Next slide, please, Logan. And this table shows the exact amounts for each increase. For more detail on the increases to specific tasks, we've posted a redline version of the UPWP as well as a clean copy. And this table can also be found in the memo posted on the meeting calendar for today. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to Eric Barassa to go into a little bit more detail about the increases to specific subtasks.
Yeah, thank you, Sri Lekha. Just a little bit of background here. I was inadvertently just left off of a communication over the summer about the increased federal funds that the region received, particularly the FTA funds. I found out about it as we were actually putting the UPWP out in August for public comment, and we decided that we would bring, instead of kind of halting that process and messing up the timeline for getting it finalized and get to the feds, we would just go with an amendment, or in this case, an adjustment. So these are all of the MAPC task items in the UPWP. What I've largely done is spread that increase among these 9 task items. The 2 biggest ones that we're increasing, 40,000 for the corridor sub-area planning studies and about 20,000 for the alternative mode planning coordination. For corridor sub-area planning, the bulk of that increase is going to support our work around the MBTA communities 3A requirement for cities and towns that have MBTA stations to zone for multifamily housing. We're doing a lot of work in this arena, and we particularly want to make sure that that zoning has a strong transit-oriented and transportation connection to those transit stations. So that's going to help us with both our technical assistance and kind of data and research to make that work even stronger. And then the $20,000 increase is focused on the work that we're doing with municipalities around electric vehicle charging infrastructure across the region. So in just kind of a nutshell, I wanted to highlight those 2. The remainder are kind of just, we're spreading those funds among those programs, just increasing staff time a bit in those areas, but happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Eric. So with that, I would like to ask this board to vote to endorse adjustment 1 to the federal fiscal year 2023 Unified Planning Work Program. And at this point, I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. Any questions for staff or Eric? Seeing none, can I get a motion and a second to approve this adjustment? As mentioned earlier, it's an adjustment, so it doesn't have to go out for public review. And this is a motion to endorse. Can I get a motion in a second? And please state your name for the record when making the motion. Leonard Diggins.
Leonard Diggins Advisory Council, I make a motion to endorse the adjustment to the Unified Planning Work Program. Thank you.
Tom Bent.
Tom Bent, City of Somerville. I want to second that motion.
Thank you. Judy, please call the roll.
David Muller,
Yes.
John Bouchard,
John Bouchard, yes.
John Romano,
John Romano, yes.
Laura Gilmore,
Laura Gilmore, yes.
Eric Barassa,
Eric Barassa, yes.
Amira Patterson,
Mayor Patterson, yes.
Leonard Diggins,
Leonard Diggins, yes.
Bill Conroy,
Bill Conroy, yes.
Jim Fitzgerald,
Jim Fitzgerald, yes.
Jay Monty,
Jay Monty, yes.
David Kozis,
David Kozis, yes.
Heather Hamilton,
Heather Hamilton, yes.
Tom Bent,
Tom Bent, yes.
Austin Siganowitz,
Austin Saganowicz, yes.
Dennis Giambetti,
Dennis Giambetti, yes.
Melissa Tentokolis,
Sorry, yes, Melissa, yes.
and Tom O'Rourke.
Tom O'Rourke, yes.
Thank you. That calls the roll.
Thank you. Next item on the agenda is a presentation of the TIP Universal projects. Back to Ethan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, I am back. Say with the good mornings. So the purpose of this part of the presentation is to go over the project universe for the federal fiscal years 2024 to 2028 TIP, which represents the upcoming one. If we move on to the next slide. So today's presentation is going to cover the development timeline for the upcoming TIP, how this TIP is being developed in accordance with Destination 2050, the long-range transportation plan, a review of the previous federal fiscal year 2023 to 2027 TIP, which is also currently in effect, and the project development process that has applied to both that TIP, the upcoming one, and all subsequent TIPs. That will then segue into a summary of the federal fiscal years 2024 to 28 universe, which will inform the evaluation process that is coming this winter for new project programming scenarios, along with next steps and a discussion on the universe itself. So if we move on to the next slide. So we'll start with a graphical overview of what a TIP development timeline may look like, particularly with regard to the 2024 to 2028 TIP. If we move on to the next slide, you can kind of see how the TIP will be developed between late October, which is already passed, into when the MPO staff are currently targeting endorsement for the final 2024 to 2028 TIP, being a target date of June 1st, 2023. Next slide, please. So to go into more detail on what this timeline looks like, this month, staff are continuing to collect data to support TIP development and scoring, which is an effort that had begun in October. This also includes applications for community connections projects, which opened on November 7th. And as of this morning, November 17th, applications for other TIP projects have also opened. In concurrence with this, MPO staff are also working with municipalities to hold one-on-one meetings regarding project concerns, and also meetings on TIP how-tos, as Tegan mentioned earlier in this presentation. The first of which was held November 15th, and the second of which will be happening after this meeting at 2 p.m. today, November 17th. The application window for TIP projects, including community connections, intersection improvements, complete streets, major infrastructure, bicycle and pedestrian transit modernization, will all conclude on December 23rd, which will then commence a project evaluation period between January 27th, project evaluation period from late December into January, where that will then commence a back and forth dialogue between MPO staff and project proponents, where they may review their preliminary evaluation and scoring results. If we move on to the next slide, we can see how this process continues into the spring. In February, Mass DOT intends to hold their TIP readiness days earlier in February, so that they may provide an update on the readiness of projects currently programmed in the TIP for execution, where staff will review these projects in advance of the March 2nd MPO meeting, where that readiness update will be presented. But stepping back a bit, back into mid-February, after a preliminary review of scoring results come in for the projects that may be incorporated into the subsequent TIP, this 2024 to 2028 one, that will commence discussions with project proponents, where those final evaluation scores, which are not only informed by the applications that proponents submitted, but also the ongoing dialogues that that staff have with those proponents, will then be presented to the MPO board at the February 17th meeting. All of this then rolls into the March 18th meeting, which comes together in the form of the draft programming scenarios for projects. A programming scenario is effectively a bundle of projects that is determined to be potentially eligible for funding based on different MPO and regional priorities. These scenarios may show which applications could be programmed in the federal fiscal year 2024 to 28 cycle for funding, and any other project changes, be they readiness or budget, that may appear in the draft 2024 to 28 TIP. In line with last year's efforts, scenario review will require 2 MPO meetings to fully review, and we will continue our discussion on these on April 6th before one is selected and presented for MPO approval, public review, and comment on April 20th. This year, staff expects that the final fiscal year 2024-28 TIP will be ready for endorsement at the June 1st meeting. For some perspective, last year, the current 2023-27 TIP was endorsed at a May 26th meeting. Next slide, please. So to provide a review of what the current TIP looks like, if we go on to the next slide. When the 2023-27 TIP was being developed, it allocated funding to 23 new projects, 11 of which were within the Community Connections program. This was driven by the signing of the bipartisan infrastructure law, which increased regional target funding by 20% over the levels in the 2022 to 2026 TIP. This, relatively speaking, was 23 new projects versus 10 new ones in that TIP and 8 in the 2021 to 25 TIP. This amounted to $224 million in new funds that were allocated to new projects, but also included the delay of 2 projects, being improvements to Boylston Street and reconstruction of Rutherford Avenue, both of which were in the city of Boston. Next slide, please. Provide a little bit more of a drill down on the specific community connections projects that were funded here. These community connections projects consisted of microtransit and shuttle service expansions for some of the regional transit authority partners, and also some of our local partners in Watertown and Newton, and also Stoneham. There was also blue bikes and bike share system expansion for Cambridge, Malden, Medford, and Salem, and also bicycle parking projects for Acton and Belmont. Next slide, please. As far as how these projects came to be in the TIP, there's a project development process that exists for not only community connections projects, but all other funding categories. If we move on to the next slide, this diagram shows the project life cycle, and the blue components of the diagram really show where these projects are at today for the upcoming TIP. Now, the project universe is really a living document. So this is a different process for, or rather, the projects that are contained therein are at different stages here. But for purposes of our discussion today, the slides are highlighted as they are. But really, all projects begin with conversations with MPO staff and conversations with the Mass DOT highway districts. When projects are being initiated, they will proceed through a need form, initiation forms, which are within a project intake tool, and then eventually Mass DOT's project review committee approval. This helps to feed in the TIP universe of projects, which either start with those conversations with municipal stakeholders or in those discussions that the MPO has with Mass DOT and its other state partners to identify which projects may be a priority. Before a project commences its environmental design, permitting, and right-of-way process, however, there's a key stage in the 25% design category, which is a preliminary requirement where a project may be evaluated with TIP criteria, seen in that middle bubble on this diagram. When a project receives that 25% design threshold, it may then be evaluated for inclusion in a subsequent TIP, which would then allow it to be potentially included within a future programming scenario for review in the spring. Next slide, please. This leads us really to the meat and potatoes of this presentation, which is the summary of the federal fiscal years 2024 to 28 universe. If we move on to the next slide, the universe, again, is a living document, and it really starts with the baseline, that baseline being the final federal fiscal years 2023 to 27 universe that was presented to the MPO last fall, minus projects that were programmed in the 2023 to 27 TIP, and any projects that were deactivated. The TIP universe is really a refinement of a long-form project list tracker that is informed by virtual meetings with municipal TIP contacts, meetings with MAPC and various sub-regional groups, and any feedback that there is obtained from Mass DOT highway district offices. Next slide, please. So the bottom line of the project universe is that it contains 105 projects within it. All of the projects that are in the universe are at different stages of development. Some may be at 100% design. Some may be at a stage where they have not even received project review committee approval yet. You can see here by this table that the Inner Core has 37 projects in the universe. Minuteman Advisory Group has 7, Metro West 7, North Shore 8. And you can see the other sub-regional groups therein. But of those 105 projects at the bottom line, 53 are complete streets, 20 are intersection improvements, 17 are bicycle and pedestrian, and 15 are currently categorized as major infrastructure. This leads us to the second asterisk of the TIP universe of projects, where the universe does not include transit modernization projects or community connections projects at this time, though the MPO staff still track them and any local initiatives that are presented to staff. If we go to the next slide, please. So the TIP universe is a working document. To add some perspective as where this TIP universe stands versus the one that was presented for the 2023 to 27 TIP, that universe had 95 projects in it versus the 105 being presented today. However, of those, the 105, it must be noted that some of those projects, that 10 project difference, does not include the numerous projects that were selected for programming in the current TIP. So in reality, over approximately 20 or so new projects have been added to this universe for that bottom line figure. But really, the universe is a snapshot in time. This number is changing every day as the MPO staff engage with different municipalities, and the budget figures, project scopes, and also categorizations of projects, be they intersection improvements or complete streets, are subject to continued feedback and may adjust. Really, the TIP universe functions as a way to kick off the discussion as far as what projects may appear within the Transportation Improvement Program for next year. Some projects, as mentioned previously, have also not yet been approved by Mass DOT's Project Review Committee. This is one way for MPO staff to track local prioritization of projects, any kinds of regional needs for early intervention, and maybe the provision of any assistance. Moreover, of these 105 projects, logistically speaking, not all projects will be scored this year. In previous years, that figure has been more towards approximately 12 projects or more. And also, of course, as of today, and also since November 7th, Transportation Improvement Program and Community Connections applications are open for municipalities to submit into. So while we are presenting the project universe, there may be projects that are applied for today that were not in the universe or may be in the universe. It's really, again, only a snapshot. If we go to the next slide, this really takes us into the scoring that will be coming in MPO meetings subsequent to this one. This chart shows a history of scoring trends for each TIP cycle. As you can see, the pandemic correlated with a reduction in the applications that were submitted for other investment programs in the TIP. However, the introduction of community connections funding led to effectively more applications overall. And as applications come in, MPO staff will determine how many projects will be scored for evaluation in a given TIP cycle. And we hope to see more applications from municipalities this time around. One important thing to note about this graph, though, is that the number of projects does not indicate total funding levels. It's important to note that the kinds of projects that appear in the Community Connections program, numerically speaking, will likely have lower funding values than other forms of capital projects. For example, there are projects within the Community Connections program that may amount to less than $25,000 worth of capital improvements, including bike racks, for example, whereas projects in complete streets may be around $15 million. Next slide, please. So as far as key important dates and some next steps, if we go into the next slide, over the coming weeks, MPO staff are going to continue gathering project information to take the MPO universe that is being presented today and will also be posted today with its associated tables to see all projects contained in the universe for review as we move not only into the application season prior to scoring, but also as we begin to consider what kind of programming scenarios and regional priorities the MPO staff are looking to further. 4 weeks away from today is that December 23rd deadline for the submission of project information for application. And the 2 months that follow that will then be the commencement of project scoring and that kind of ongoing dialogue, not only with the MPO board, but also the project proponents, sub-regional groups, and other stakeholders in the project development process. With that, I'd like to move to the next slide and open the floor to any questions there are on the TIP universe.
Thank you, Ethan. Any questions from anyone? Eric Barassa.
Ethan, I apologize if I didn't get this straight, but the chart that you showed about the number of projects that are getting scored, that excluding the community connections, overall that's down. Is that correct? We are getting fewer projects that are at the level of readiness to be scored in the pipeline?
Yes, so if we could go back, I think it's 3 or so slides to that graph just to illustrate it again. Right there, thank you. So yes, the overall number of projects outside of the Community Connections program has gone down, and this largely correlates with the pandemic. Fewer projects were being applied for. So not only were fewer projects being scored, I think, based on project readiness, but there were also just fewer coming in. One important factor is state and local match and the availability there during the pandemic, and also some of the uncertainty, staffing restrictions, and adaptation that was being made during the pandemic to make such applications available. But as you can also see, the Community Connections program and its introduction during the pandemic had helped to offset that total number of projects to make more tactical improvements. We're hoping that with better adaptation to pandemic conditions, that we can see a reversal of the total number of projects being scored and applied for by the TIP to pre-pandemic levels around the 20 to 25 or perhaps even more level, which is part of why we also have a slightly longer than usual application window for projects this year.
Okay, I think this is something to keep an eye on, particularly because we have increased federal funding, discretionary grants, whole set of things. And if we feel like, particularly on our municipal side, there's sort of not a pipeline of projects or we need to, just make sure we're communicating with folks about the process. And that's obviously, our responsibility. So we should, keep an eye on this as the TIP development happens.
Leonard Diggins.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Hey, what's the maximum number of projects staff could score?
So
The range kind of like, would it be?
there is no firm number of projects that the staff will score. Projects are scored based on their merit, how they fit with regional priorities and criteria. So in theory,
I'm sorry. Go ahead. In theory, yes.
oh yeah, in theory, in theory, there is no limit. It's mostly a constraint by the amount of time that is available for scoring and the overall levels of funding available. At the end of the day, the number of projects being scored is not necessarily the determining factor of what gets programmed. It's the fiscal constraint. So 40 projects may be scored, but if 40 projects are scored versus 30 and only 10 can be programmed, the bottom line kind of is still the same in that sense, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
Also,
no, I was just trying to understand the capacity. So I was really trying to understand what would be the maximum number of range that staff could score based on the availability of staff. Yeah.
Yeah, and then the other bottleneck as well is just the number of applications we receive. So if we receive fewer applications, there may be fewer projects to score. But I would also mention as well that some projects that may have been applied for in a prior year that were not scored may be reevaluated in a subsequent year, or projects that were scored last year that may have received a good score but were not programmed in the TIP may also be considered for future programming scenarios as well, if their project readiness is in line.
Okay, let me ask you another question. How long does it take to score a project? And I ask this because sometimes we get to like the end of the process, and then we need to make some quick selections, and then we're doing them without scoring. And so like, I know it depends on the nature of the project, but kind of a range. It's like, let's say you're really like challenged to crank out a score quickly. What would you say would be the minimum of time to take a score project?
So unfortunately, given that I am new to my position with the MPO and I have not gone through the scoring process with this organization before, I cannot attest to that today. I will circle back with you. I did send out a kickoff email to the MPO staff yesterday. We have multiple internal stakeholders that facilitate this scoring process across our different skill sets within the organization. And as part of discussions that we'll be having in the upcoming weeks within MPO staff, that will help us to figure out our capacity and also what kind of turnaround we are looking at for basically per project application delivery.
Thank you. Totally fine. And I appreciate that. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Dennis Giambetti.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a quick question in regards to the decline of the number of projects that are coming forward. As we go out to the sub-regions and we talk to the folks, do they have any sort of rationale or reasons why they see a decline, and do they see any uptick in the future? Have we asked that question?
So in the meetings that MPO staff have had with some of our, I can say from my discussions with various municipalities and one-on-ones, a recurring theme was not only some of the changes that occurred during the pandemic regarding staffing levels, and also simply availability of match funding and also that level of uncertainty, but also the ability to execute projects, as has been discussed by this committee and board prior, were also some more recent concerns regarding changes in cost due to inflation of various inputs. That kind of uncertainty and also availability of local match and staff capacity can be hindrances. However, this is also a case of correlation. I do not know the entirety of the causes, but we are still investigating that. I would be happy to circle back with you.
Thanks.
Chris Timmel.
Yes, thank you. Just a quick question. Can you remind me, so on the scoring process, can you remind me, when you talk about readiness, what is the threshold there for when a project is ready for scoring? Is it 25% design? Is that right?
So 25% design reflects the minimum threshold, and that 25% design figure was the result of a project cost review committee that was created to ensure that to minimize the probability that cost fluctuations would be seen within the TIP after a project was programmed. So it is 25% design at a minimum, but a project may be scored if it has at a higher level of design for reference.
Right, okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Jim Fitzgerald.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So that December 23rd, thanks for putting this slide up. That's what my question was based on. That's the deadline to submit project information for consideration in the universe. And that's just submitting to CTPS staff, to Ethan. If it's
So
a
the
new project.
universe is just a snapshot. You can add a project to the universe at any time. If you send any correspondence to MPO staff to indicate interest in a certain initiative, we will do that any time of year. However, in order to apply for a project for scoring and evaluation for the receipt of funding, that must happen by December 23rd.
Right, and I'm just confirming what that is. That is giving you project details if it's a new project, right? That's not already on there.
Yes, if it is a new project, or also if you have a project that currently exists within the universe. And of course, if you have questions about what is in the universe, you could also indicate your priorities and say, could you consider this project again this year?
Excellent, thank you.
Claire Ricker.
I'm sorry, that was a mistake.
No worries. Any other questions or comments? Seeing none. Thank you, Ethan.
Oh, sorry, Mr. Chair. I did re-raise
Oh, I'm
my
sorry.
hand.
I'm sorry.
No worries.
I didn't see it.
I'm assuming Ethan can share this great presentation for us to check in with our colleagues.
Yes, of course. So in addition to this presentation, which is being recorded and will be posted online, these slides will also be available. And also the table that shows the totality, all 105 projects in the universe, all projects that were programmed, that advertised over the past year, or that were removed from the universe for various reasons, will also be provided online after this meeting. And that also will be in accordance with some of the how-to presentations as well, which go into a little bit more detail on the development process.
Perfect, thank you.
Any other questions or comments?
Mr. Chair, I do see Dennis Ciambetti's hand up. I'm not sure if he wants to make a comment.
I think Dennis forgot to put his hand down after his last comment, but Dennis? So that was just a forget to put your hand down. Any other comments or questions? Seeing none, thank you, Ethan. Next presentation is on addressing equity and access in the Blue Hills. It will be by Stella Jordan and Sean Rourke. Stella, are you first?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I think we're both going, but I believe Sean will be sharing our presentation.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair, and good morning, everyone. I'm just going to share my screen and then I will get started. All right. Can everyone see the unlocking the Blue Hills story map and just that, not my notes? Okay. All right, thank you, Mr. Chair, and good morning. My name is Sean Rourke, and I am the manager of the communications and engagement team at CTPS. You'll also be hearing from my colleague, Stella Jordan, who is the public engagement program manager on staff. We'll be presenting the results of the federal fiscal year 2022 UPWP funded study addressing equity and access in the Blue Hills. The final report for this study is in the form of a story map. And when we were practicing our presentation, we realized that presenting the full story map via screen sharing is challenging because it gets very chaotic with the amount of content and all the scrolling. So we've created here an abbreviated version of the story map so that way you can see the visuals and the maps, but the content has been whittled down into bullet points. But the link to the full story map is on today's meeting calendar, and it will also be put in the chat so that you can look through it later. The story map will be posted on the MPO website by the beginning of next week, so you will also be able to find it there. after this presentation. To remind everyone about the origin of this study, in early 2021, a coalition of advocacy organizations approached the MPO to propose a study of public transit access to the Blue Hills Reservation. The coalition's proposal highlighted the challenges faced by transit-dependent Boston residents in accessing the Blue Hills. The coalition specifically stressed the difficulty of accessing the Blue Hills from Mattapan, a neighborhood less than 5 miles from the reservation. We worked with the coalition to refine their proposal and develop a work scope, and the work scope was presented and approved by the MPO board this past March. The goals of this study were to, 1, strengthen the MPO's relationship with the community and advocacy organizations that proposed the study through a process of continuous engagement. 2, to analyze existing public transit access to the Blue Hills and the inequity of access between drivers and transit users. 3, to design multiple possible solutions to improve access. And 4, to create a study product that could serve as a resource to stakeholders.
So we scoped this study to incorporate continuous engagement with the coalition that proposed the study, along with additional relevant organizations and agencies. Representatives from these organizations comprised an advisory group that we consulted at key points throughout the study to help guide our work. The advisory group included representatives from the Friends of the Blue Hills, Mattapan Food and Fitness Coalition, Mary May Binney Wakefield Arboretum, Brookwood Community Farm, Blue Hills Community Health Alliance, the Livable Streets Alliance, the Metropolitan Area Planning Council, and the Town of Milton. In addition to our advisory group meetings, we also engaged other advocacy groups, nonprofits, community groups, and neighborhood associations active in Mattapan and surrounding areas, and often at the recommendation of the advisory group, to discuss their experiences and opinions on accessing the Blue Hills and other green spaces via public transit. One of those meetings with someone from the nonprofit organization Outdoor Afro actually took place during a hike in the Blue Hills where Sean and I climbed to the top of Great Blue Hill. And in total, over the course of the study, we held 5 advisory group meetings, 12 one-on-one follow-up conversations with members of the advisory group, and 8 one-on-one meetings with other groups. And in the early phases of the study, we conducted a literature review to better understand the documented environmental and health inequities in communities of color and lower income neighborhoods such as Mattapan. These communities have generally higher exposure to environmental and health burdens due to air quality issues, the placement and impact of infrastructure, and systemic inequities. The coalition of organizations that proposed this study highlighted the physical and mental health benefits of access to green spaces like the Blue Hills, and literature that we reviewed supported that. Increasing access to green and outdoor recreation space has been identified as an important way to improve public health inequities and disparities, and this is especially true in dense urban environments. Access to green space has also been documented as an important element of social cohesion, which again supports improved health outcomes. The results of our literature review were very consistent with what we heard from stakeholders as well. So particularly those people living and working in and around Mattapan, who highlighted to us the importance of access to places like the Blue Hills for mental health and well-being, community building, environmental education, and childhood development. So to zoom out now and provide a bit of background on the Blue Hills itself, it's a 7,000-acre state park, only about 10 miles south of downtown Boston. As you can see on the map here, it connects to the Neponset River State Reservation, which includes a network of greenways and protected areas that extends north through Hyde Park, Mattapan, and Dorchester. The Blue Hills is an important recreation and educational destination for residents throughout the region. It offers over 100 miles of trails, ponds and swimming areas, picnic areas, sports fields and playgrounds, as well as a ski slope, community farm, and a museum with educational programs. So we worked with the advisory group to identify an area of focus on the neighborhood side for our current analysis of of current access. We settled on the southern Boston neighborhoods of Roxbury, Dorchester, Hyde Park, and Mattapan. Together, these neighborhoods are home to 235,000 people, which is approximately 1/3 of the city of Boston's population. And we did some demographic analysis of these neighborhoods to compare them to the Boston MPO region as a whole. So, as demonstrated on the map here, collectively 81% of the people in these communities identify as minorities. That's compared to 37% in the overall Boston MPO region. 38% of residents in these communities are considered low income, and that's compared to 20% in the overall Boston MPO region. And then 32% of households in these communities do not own a car and rely on public transit, compared to only 17% in the overall Boston region.
In our conversations with the advisory group, we asked them to identify the most popular destinations in the Blue Hills with the most amenities. Currently, transit users in Boston have access to only 2 destinations within the reservation. And in contrast, drivers have access to all 20 access points and all amenities within the Blue Hills. This inequity of access can be demonstrated by comparing transit travel times to the Trailside Museum from neighborhoods within the study area with driving times from suburban towns in the Boston region. For example, on a typical Saturday at 10 a.m., driving from the town of Acton, which is 32 miles from the Blue Hills, takes 40 minutes, whereas taking transit from Boston neighborhoods less than 10 miles away can take upwards of an hour. Sorry, I'm very delicately trying to scroll here so I don't scroll past it. The current transit options to get to the Blue Hills from Boston are 2 bus routes. The 716, which runs from Mattapan and stops at the Trailside Museum. This route does not currently operate on Sundays. And then there's also the 238, which serves parts of Dorchester and stops at the eastern edge of the Blue Hills at Shea Rink. The MBTA 240 and the BAT 12 stop near the Blue Hills, but not at any access points that are accessible for hiking or any of the other amenities. We did consider the bus network redesign in our analysis, and we updated our analysis to reflect the updated proposal released a few weeks ago because it did have some implications for our analysis of the 238 route. After analyzing current access, MPO staff designed several possible transit service improvements, which were further refined by input from the advisory group. These options consider feasibility and operational costs, with estimates assuming a single small bus running on a contracted route between 8 a.m. and 6 p.m. from April 1st to October 31st, which is the peak visitor season for the Blue Hills. We identified Houghton's Pond, a popular recreation area in the center of the Blue Hills, as the single most important destination and access point to amenities, and this is reflected in the proposed transit service improvements. Currently, Houghton's Pond is completely inaccessible by public transit, denying transit-dependent Boston area residents access to its 24-acre swimming pond and beach, fishing, picnic tables, sports field, playgrounds, and access to many of the Blue Hills hiking trails. So for our proposed transit service improvement options, the first option we explored was a modification to existing MBTA service on the 716 route. The 716 currently runs from Monday through Saturday between Mattapan Square and Cobb's Corner in Canton, with a short diversion down Royal Street in Canton, which primarily serves office buildings. Option 1A proposes that on Saturdays, instead of diverting to Royal Street, the route diverts down Blue Hill River Road to Houghton's Pond. This modification could be made with no additional cost to the MBTA and with minimal modifications to the current Saturday service schedule. Another variation on this proposal, option 1B, would add Sunday service to the 716 bus route with the same Houghton's Pond diversion. Based on recent small bus service contracts and operational costs, staff estimates that the cost of adding Sunday service to the 716 to be about $20,000 per year. Both of these routes would run hourly with a 2-hour gap in the middle of the day, similar to the current service on the 716. Implementing option 1A or 1B would be the simplest, most feasible way to improve transit access to the Blue Hills, according to our analysis. The next set of options we explored would institute a new fixed route bus service operating in a loop from Mattapan Station and serving multiple destinations in the Blue Hills. We explored 3 variations of this loop, which we're calling options 2A, 2B, and 2C. Assuming the same service cost calculations as the previous option, we estimate that the annual operating cost for all of the option 2 variations would be about $40,000. Option 2A is the largest loop we mapped out and would serve destinations throughout the Blue Hills, including most of the essential destinations identified by the advisory group. The frequency of this loop would be about every 2 hours, given how long the route is. If an additional bus were added to increase frequency, this would double the annual operating cost to about $80,000. Option 2B is a western loop that covers the western edge of the Blue Hills. This would serve about half of the essential destinations identified by the advisory group. We estimate that the frequency of this route would be about 60 minutes. Option 2C is an eastern loop that would serve the middle and eastern portions of the Blue Hills. This route would also serve about half of the essential destinations identified by the advisory group. Frequency would be about 75 minutes, and adding another vehicle, again, to increase frequency would double the estimated operating cost to about $80,000. We also explored another service option, an app-based microtransit service that would connect locations in and around the Blue Hills. This option was not favorably received by the advisory group, and we ultimately did not consider it for further study due to the cost of developing a mobile application and dispatch service and the unreliability of cellular service within the Blue Hills. The options outlined here and the story map we created are intended to serve as a resource that stakeholders can use to propose a service pilot program. This pilot could be funded and operated by a combination of municipalities, state agencies, regional agencies, and advocate stakeholders who could collaborate on operating and marketing the service. It's important to note that none of the options we explored serve every destination identified by stakeholders, and all the routes focus on a single origin point in Mattapan Square. In conversations throughout the study, the advisory group and other stakeholders expressed a strong interest in expanding access to more destinations and connecting to existing transit hubs in Dorchester and Hyde Park. Additional considerations stakeholders emphasized include sensitivity to community contexts and neighborhood change, and attention to the accessibility of physical infrastructure, such as pedestrian safety and signage at bus stops within the Blue Hills. The insights from the stakeholders we consulted throughout the study were crucial in guiding our work and ensuring that we were addressing the needs of the community. In order to maintain trust and connections with the community, continuous engagement is critical to the success of any future work to expand on this study or implement a pilot program.
Yeah, so we really plan for this work to be a resource for stakeholders to carry forward. And we look forward to supporting those efforts by continuing to strengthen our relationships with the groups we worked with on this study, and to also help facilitate future connections to funding and collaboration opportunities for a pilot, including through exploring relevant MPO funding programs such as Community Connections or MassDOT's Community Transit Grant Program. The engagement process for both this study and the Transportation Inequities study presented by our colleague Betsy Harvey at the last MPO meeting really helped us strengthen our relationships with community stakeholders in the Boston area. And we do plan to continue our engagement work with both studies by presenting at community and advocacy group meetings. We've actually already been invited to speak at a civic association in Mattapan about both studies. And now, we believe this model of post-study engagement, along with creating easily accessible study products such as Story Map, will allow the MPO's work to reach a broader audience and increase stakeholder understanding of our role in regional transportation planning. We would really like to thank the many contributors to this study, including the advisory group and all of the stakeholders who took the time to meet with us, some of whom I believe are here with us today, as well as our colleagues at CTPS, Jonathan Belcher and Emily DeMonico for transit analysis and mapping, Megan O'Connor for research and editing, Betsy Harvey for equity analysis, Adriana Frattini for illustration and graphic design, and finally, Annette Dempster for guiding Sean and I through our very first study. So thank you for your time. Sean and I are more than happy to take any questions or feedback you may have for us at this point.
Thank you both. Questions from members? Eric Barassa.
Hi, great job, guys. Really interested in looking at this. I also really like the story map format too. It's a very accessible way of, I think, presenting the findings, which is, I think, this first time we've done, the MPO has done a story map. So one question I have is, did you all look at any type of seasonal service? So I always think of, I feel like one of the most successful programs that the MPO ever helped launch was the Essex Ipswich Explorer, which is a bus up in Ipswich that runs from the commuter rail station down to Crane Beach, and it's operated by CADA. And I believe we gave them the seed money, and they've continued that. But it's seasonal. It runs from like mid-June to mid-September. I don't know. Did you guys look at a seasonal service just because of the cost?
Yeah, so the options, first I want to say the MPO has done a couple of additional story maps. There was one on for an inequity study, and then there was one for a blue bike study, and then there was also one for presenting the results of the big ideas focus groups that were done earlier on in the LRTP cycle, and there may have been more too. So the in terms of the seasonal kind of shuttle, we actually priced the costs of these, the cost estimates based on seasonal service from April 1st through October 31st, because those are the peak visiting times for the Blue Hills. And we also, I think the cost estimates were actually based partially on that service and also other work that CTPS has done in doing cost estimates for other, specific location-based seasonal shuttle services.
Awesome. Thank you, Sean. And thanks for correcting the record. I apologize.
No, I wanted to make sure, everyone else is getting credit. I think we might be the first study that only did a story map. Like, we don't have an accompanying report or memo. We put all of our our analysis and results in the story map. So in that way, we might be the first.
Leonard Diggins.
Yes, you're just humble bragging that you've been ahead of the curve for a long, long time. So we get it, and we love you for it, So I mean, I kind of missed it. So is the pilot going to touch all of the important stops that the proponents, being the advocates, had requested or thought were important?
So just to be clear, there isn't a pilot in development. This story map is meant to be used to, be a resource to advocates to advocate for a pilot and maybe put together a proposal. The proposals that we crafted hit as many of the destinations identified by the advisory group as possible. But there are a couple destinations in like the very southern portion of the Blue Hills that just, if we included those, would have made the loops just way too long to be feasible. But of course, if this proved to be really popular and there were multiple vehicles, that opens up the possibility of serving those destinations as well.
Right. Well, I mean, so my comments on those headways, I mean, they're just really long. I mean, so I would say to the extent that I mean, even if you cut it down in half, I mean, they're still pretty long. I mean, but 75 minutes, that's a long time. So I would hope that any stops would have shelters, because I think that would certainly make it easier, because if cell phone reception is an issue, then people aren't really even going to be able to use an app, to tell when the bus is really coming. We have to schedule. That's about it. But as we know now, we all kind of like rely on our apps in order to tell us how far the bus is, so that we spend a minimum of time waiting. But if you're not going to have that information, then you're certainly going to have a shelter. And now for just a technical question regarding accessing this. So was it available before the meeting? I mean, I kind of thought I heard Stella say that, because I was looking for it and I couldn't find it. So if I'm just not missing it, please help me so that I don't do so in the future.
The link to the full story map was added to the calendar recently. It wasn't available with the rest of the materials. It's, because we weren't sure about presenting like the full version of the story map in case
Yeah.
there were comments about, making changes or editing, but then we decided that would be helpful if the people in the meeting here, including the board, wanted to pull up the full story map. And either for after the meeting or to follow along. But yeah, if we're gonna keep doing story maps in lieu of reports, I guess we should figure out a process for when do we share the full story map for the board.
Yeah, because it helps to like see it in advance. What I still don't see it. And that's fine. You dropped in the chat. I was able to get in the chat, and for the benefit of others, it's fairly easy to generate a PDF of it. Easily. So thanks. No, good job. Thank you.
Other questions from members? Seeing none, is there anyone from the public who would like to comment at this time? Wait, I'm sorry, Bill Conroy.
Yeah, thank you. This is great. Being raised and living in Stony Brook all my life, I frequent this place quite a bit and learned how to ski over the Blue Hills. As for a seasonal point, yeah, it has its challenges getting people to and from, but I think there's a large amount of people that do frequent the Blue Hills for a variety of events and a variety of activities. That being seasonal as well, summertime, Houghton's Pond and other places as well. I guess my question is, what type of shuttles are currently being run out there? Does the Blue Hills, the ski area, currently run a shuttle out here, or is Houghton's Pond running a shuttle as well?
No, there are no, as far as we're aware, there are no regular shuttle services that are running to get people around destinations to the Blue Hills. There's a lot of parking areas and there's a lot of parking spots, and so it really has been designed to be accessible to drivers, but not transit users.
Right. Yeah. Thank you for that. And I defer back to what Eric was saying up on the North Shore with that with their shuttle service up there. Which really worked out well. Yeah, I'd be interested more from the community's perspective, from an equitable point, as to what their thoughts are as far as getting to and from, and what time the pilot would be running the bus service to and from. Albeit that it seems to be, the service isn't as frequent, but once again, getting there and then getting the bus from, a lot of people spend a lot of time out here as well. So blocks of, whatever that be, maybe 4 to 6 hours might be adequate for running some type of program as well. So Thank you, and thank you for your team. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. Jim Fitzgerald.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And just to follow up what Bill said, this is great work. We appreciate it. So if what you found out about diverting the 716 on weekends seems like almost like could be an early action option here, and something that, while funding and the sort of shuttle option is sorted out, could take longer. Certainly will take longer. Obviously, the bus network redesign map is being voted on, and it doesn't have this in it. So, how receptive was the MBTA to this in your conversations, or is that kind of like a next step to really get into the weeds with them?
That's a next step. Since this this study isn't proposing like an MPO action to establish a pilot program. We did have some conversations with, or at least some we had some connections to the MBTA bus network redesign project. Yeah. And it's with the timing of this, it's not, if this happened like a year ago, it would have been a lot more
easier.
Would have been a lot more possible to include this. But one good thing is that the 716 is a contracted route. So there might be like additional like flexibility there to alter it more often. And so that's something that like the project proponents, if this becomes a proposal, can consider, that there might be more flexibility there outside of the bus network redesign.
And did you get into the operating, at least cursory any operating issues with accessing the parking lot at Houghton's? All those things feel like they're achievable, like
Yeah,
big
so
hurdles
buses,
there?
like school buses, like frequently
Right.
drop off and pick up there. And the 716 bus is smaller than a school bus, so there shouldn't be any challenges there.
And just reiterating what I think you concluded on the operating on a Saturday with the current schedule, what you found is that in theory it could fit into the schedule and not all that kind of. It just seems
Yeah,
like
it's a similar length diversion that to the diversion that happens to the
Yeah.
office park. Yeah.
Right. Righto. All right. Cool. Thank you.
Abby Jamil. And please.
Abby, hello. Abby
Please
was a
excuse me.
member of our advisory group.
Hi, everyone. I'm happy to be here and super happy to see all of the hard work that Stella and Sean and the team have put forward over the last few months actually go in front of more people. So very excited to see that. My name is Abby Jamil. I work for Livable Streets Alliance. My title is the Emerald Network Director, but basically it just means that I advocate for creating green spaces and greenways throughout the city of Boston. So just want to voice publicly our support with Livable Streets Alliance for this pilot, or for this actually to be put into a pilot form. It's of course really critical to have these connections, particularly in places like Mattapan, Dorchester, Roxbury, etc. And again, just want to elevate and amplify that we had a great time working on the advisory board and just fully support this process. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments from the MPO or public at this time? Seeing none, great work, and keep us updated as the pilot moves forward, guys.
Thank you.
Very good work. Thank you very much. Next up is a presentation on a scan of integrating transit and truck priorities. Andy Johnston.
Good morning. Well, that was a tough act to follow, but I will try. I am here to present a memo that I've been working on under the auspices of the MPO Freight Planning Program, as Tegan said before, for a number of months in partnership with several other agencies. The memo is posted on the meeting calendar for today. The core idea has been to take a look at where freight vehicles, that is trucks in this instance, and transit vehicles might be able to share priority roadway space, that is dedicated lanes. We'll talk a bit about the background behind the memo, the research on literature and case studies, and the conclusions and lessons learned. Next slide, please. All right. So this memo is not intended to be the final word on the topic. What we've produced is an initial scan on this issue, a way into the conversation in a fairly limited kind of way. For example, and you'll see more in a moment on how we chose this, we focused our research on arterial roadways rather than divided highways. Next slide, please. All right. So this research is rooted in the extent to which there are characteristics and interests that freight and transit vehicles share, such as that they're bigger than cars. They need a certain roadway geometry to accommodate that. They place a high value on reliability, and they tend to be highly concentrated in a subset of corridors and near certain destinations. And how these characteristics may be able to lead to cooperation in allocation of roadway space. That's certainly not a comprehensive list, but trying to get into some of the key concepts that some of the stakeholders I talked to in developing this memo suggested and that we're working with. Next slide, please. So I'm not going to dwell on this because I'll come back to it at the end, but here's a sneak preview of some of the conclusions that we came to. Shared priority between buses and trucks is possible in certain places. The goals of trying to do this should be clearly defined. And if you're trying to do it, generally speaking, we in the planning world need more data on this. Next slide, please. I think one more. This should go to the one that says local impetus, Summer Street. There we go. All right. So beyond the abstract characteristics that we just talked about, why are we looking at this now? Well, the largest part of this topic how this topic came to my attention is that there's an active plan, there's a collaboration between the City of Boston, the MBTA, and Massport and others to look at installing bus priority lanes on Summer Street in the South Boston waterfront area, otherwise known as the Seaport. And as you can read in the memo, after some negotiation, it seems that the plan is for at least a segment of those lanes to also allow use by trucks traveling between Massport's Conley Container Terminal and the interstate system. As the graphics on the slide show, this is an important corridor for both transit and freight. The number 7 bus that uses it now runs quite frequently at rush hour, and under the bus network redesign draft map, the number 7 will be through routed across downtown Boston on a new priority corridor with the number 93, creating a full-time frequent route between Sullivan Square and South Boston. Meanwhile, you have the noted Conley Terminal truck traffic on much of Summer Street, and the MPO helped recommend part of the segment to the Federal Highway Administration for designation as a critical urban freight corridor back in 2017, which is the map on the right on this slide. So the whole process of Summer Street got us thinking, and in the end, we in fact scheduled this presentation today because the design process for this project is starting to get launched as we speak. All of the relevant parties have provided support and information to this research, and we hope it's going to be helpful to them going forward as well. Next slide, please. So we started out by doing as thorough a search as possible for research literature that would be relevant to this topic of shared bus and truck lanes on arterial roadways. And I have to say, pickings were kind of slim. One major caveat is that given the bandwidth available and the skills of the available staff, we limited our search to English language literature. There's a substantial volume of research from this country on freight priority lanes, but it's almost universally about freeways, not surface roadways. Very little of what does exist involves quantitative measurement of actual experience or experiments. In countries that look to the United Kingdom for planning inspiration, the idea of shared priority has gained some intellectual traction in planning documents, influenced by the example of the Tyne and Wear region, as we'll see in our case study section, but actual implementation appears pretty rare. Next slide, please. All right, so perhaps the most interesting section of the memo is our series of case studies. I encourage you to check out the memo posted on the meeting calendar because it presents these in far more detail than it would be prudent to do here. I'd like to especially draw your attention to Appendix A, which has a snazzy matrix of our case studies put together by our spring and summer intern, Uday Schultz, and made pretty by Kim Delory from our graphics staff. We selected these case studies as examples of shared truck and bus priority, where there's been something published that we can go on to learn about it. But I also think it's actually a reasonably comprehensive list of all such implementations, at least here in North America. Where possible, I'll point out similarities to the Boston experience, but we didn't select these specifically for parallels to Summer Street or our other Boston area possibilities that are mentioned in the memo. Next slide, please. So far and away, the most common reference when you go look for information on trucks and buses sharing lanes is New York City, especially the kind of high profile 14th Street busway in Manhattan, which I'm sure many here have heard of. But that's just one of several busways that New York City has implemented. The oldest, Fulton Mall in Brooklyn, goes back to the 1970s, while the rest of them are more recent, all coming since 2018 or so. One major difference between, for example, the Summer Street corridor and what they've done in New York City is that in New York City, these are busways that are designed to accommodate local delivery trucks. We're not talking about through traffic for the most part, although there might be a few, but they really are explicitly designed to enable delivery to businesses and buildings in that corridor. Next slide, please. In terms of careful thinking about this question, Seattle is perhaps the best American example, with various institutions there having put a considerable amount of thought into freight and transit priority and how to carefully balance the two. Seattle's a port city like Boston. It's got a lot of trucks, and it also has a very bus-heavy transit system. They're now building out a significant light rail system, but until recently, it's just very, very bus-heavy and still is on certain corridors. So Seattle actually tested a short freight and transit, or FAT lane. The acronym didn't stick for obvious reasons during its Alaskan Way Viaduct project, which was their equivalent of the Big Dig. That only existed for a short time, though I've been unable to determine exactly how long, and the Seattle DOT staffer I talked to for this project didn't actually know. And it was poorly communicated to truckers, but it was carefully evaluated through video evidence by a University of Washington team and seems to have yielded mildly positive results. Seattle has also been carefully developing a planning framework for balancing freight and transit priority over the last several years. It's all leading up to what they're calling a modal integration plan, where they've developed different plans for each mode of transportation within the city, and then they're going to do a comprehensive plan to integrate that, all of that, and that all leads into the city's master planning process overall. So that draft policy calls for consideration of allowing trucks to use transit lanes where there are fewer than 20 buses per hour. Not in every case, it will be taken on a case-by-case basis, but that's kind of the trigger level where they would even consider it. And when I talked to some people in Seattle, they mentioned that they were considering a pilot on Westlake Avenue, which, if any of you know Seattle at all, leads from the South Lake Union District up toward Ballard, and then access to the highway network. Next slide, please. All right, so perhaps the highest profile in the planning literature in terms of an area that has implemented bus and truck shared priority is Tyne and Wear, which is a metro area centered around the city of Newcastle in the United Kingdom. And they implemented some what they call no car lanes. The name is pretty self-explanatory. It allows everything except for cars in the 1990s. These can operate on a full or part-time basis. And there's actually been a considerable amount of research literature by local consultants and universities looking at the implementation of these lanes, albeit they've had to reconstruct the effects through modeling because there hasn't been a lot of actual data collected. And one of the conclusions they came to was that these lanes were kind of slapped down wherever was politically convenient, and there was no real attempt to build a coherent network. So that's, I think, an important lesson to take away. The results have been mixed in the evaluations that have been done, and kind of in the longer run, many of these lanes have now been converted to conventional bus lanes in the end, because drivers felt they were confused. The transit priority element wasn't necessarily working. And as I mentioned, the evaluations that have been done indicated mixed results. Next slide, please. All right, so looking at Ottawa, it's perhaps parallel to Boston in that its street network is, shall we say, mildly dysfunctional for some purposes, or at least is being put to purposes it was never intended to be. As the federal capital of Canada, Ottawa joins the Quebec and Ontario highway networks, but no separated highway actually extends through the downtown to connect the two. So like Seattle, Ottawa was until recently a nearly exclusive bus transit city and still has many buses using downtown streets. At the same time as you're having these freeway networks pump tons and tons of trucks onto city streets. And so they had some conflicts. There were issues with long queues of buses developing at certain intersections. And they designated this very short stretch of Waller Street to keep trucks traveling between the two highway networks out of the way of the buses. And I apologize for the low resolution of the map here. I got it from a report, and they had published it in pretty low resolution. So the lane is nearly totally unmarked, but it is said to work reasonably well at times. Next slide, please. All right, so going back to the Pacific Northwest, we looked at one project in Portland, again, another port city. For those who might know Portland, this is just east of the Willamette River, across from and a little south of downtown Portland. City's been rolling out what transit priority lanes. They call them rose lanes because Portland's the rose city, and they paint them red throughout the city. And on part of this stretch of a one-way arterial couplet, they decided to try what they're calling transit truck and turn lanes. Again, pretty self-explanatory. The lanes can be used by buses, the Portland streetcar, trucks, and turning vehicles of any sort. This stretch is particularly important from a freight perspective because it links an important industrial area to the interstate network. So again, very similar to Summer Street in that regard. On the left side of the slide, there's a map of this area, and on the right, there's a diagram of the street layout, both of which are from the Portland Bureau of Transportation's project webpage, which is linked to in the memo. I was able to interview a couple of people from the Portland Bureau of Transportation, and they indicated that while there's no formal monitoring process in place for this pilot, it is continuing on a pilot basis indefinitely, and stakeholders appear to be satisfied, and it appears to be working well and largely being used by heavy trucks heading to the interstate network. Next slide, please. All right, so what do we take away? I shared a summary of the lessons at the beginning, but I want to come back here in some detail. What we have here on the slide is basically the way it's written in the memo. These are really products of our literature review and our case studies, but we hope they find some relevance also for our local partners. So number one, freight and transit have potential, although contextual, shared interests in roadway design and priority measures. That's a fancy way of saying that there are times and places where freight and transit shared priority can and will work. In many ways, both have similar interests in being shielded from car traffic. Number two, there's a shortage of actionable quantitative data on shared transit and freight priority. I've mentioned this several times as part of the case studies and literature review, but there's really very little data out there on this topic. It's very hard to evaluate new ideas for projects without much data to go on. Number three, specific goals and priorities should ideally be identified ahead of time and the specifics of a treatment designed to meet them. And really what I'm trying to get at here is that trucks and buses should share space or could share space is not really one concept, it's a spectrum. Are we talking about heavy trucks moving heavy cargo or local delivery? Do the buses need to stop? What is the roadway geometry? What does the signal system look like? There are a lot of different factors to consider and goals to meet that are unique to each situation. And ideally, that should all be addressed in advance so that the treatment can be designed or considered and analyzed in ways that are appropriate. Next slide. All right, so what can we take away that's relevant locally? First, the Summer Street project offers a golden opportunity to collect the kind of detailed before and after data that, to my knowledge, is entirely missing from the discussion of shared freight and transit priority. Second, there is more research to be done in this vein with a special eye for cases from countries that don't speak English. I'm aware of an interesting model in Barcelona where curb lanes are split between transit at certain times and freight delivery at other times and general traffic at yet other times. Finally, at some point, it might be worth looking into the characteristics that we can define that we think might suggest future pilot corridors to look at, not at the stage yet where we can indicate actual corridors, but thinking about what might help define future analysis of that. Next slide, please. All right, so that ends my content element. This was collaborative work, I think, in the best spirit of MPO work and the kinds of ways that are really required to make shared priority work. I want to thank all of the folks who helped get various drafts of this memo ready, especially our intern in spring, summer 2022, Uday Schultz, but also Joelle Barrera and Sarah Lee from Massport, Wes Edwards and Laura Gilmore at the T, Matt Moran and Hannah Archer from Boston Transportation Department, and Jim Fitzgerald and Nick Schmidt at BPDA. I also interviewed a number of people from around Boston and other areas. And then, of course, Derek Cravat and Michaela Niles of MassDOT OTP, who looked at the final draft memo, and various colleagues who gave review and support internally. Thank you to everybody. This was a lot of fun. It was a very interesting conversation to be having over a number of months. Next slide, please. All right, so at this point, I am happy to take questions and hand it back over to Mr. Chair to lead the discussion.
Thank you, Sandy. Any questions for Sandy? Leonard Diggins.
Questions and comments, Mr. Chair. Sandy, this is great. This is the headliner for me. And first I just want to say I love your writing style. It's a pleasure to read. You have a little flair to it. The phrase like consistent political masterstroke. Let me just say, if ever anyone has one of those, let me know, because I think that's the holy grail. But in any case, you kind of answered one of my questions about other things of studies done in other languages when you talked about Barcelona. And it's interesting that they have the timeshare aspect to it, because I was thinking that too. It's like, because I noticed that like in the middle of the day, on some roadways, there's hardly any traffic. It seems like a really good time, to kind of like bring in all the freight, and you can still have like a dedicated bus lane. But if it has to kind of like deviate around it because of freight or whatever, then that would be a good time to do it. Any comments on that?
Yeah, to unpack the when freight should arrive, I think is a slightly different question than the question of priority.
Okay.
As you said, midday there's less traffic, so it does make sense. And what we see, and this comes up several times in the memo and some of our case studies, that often the peak hours for trucks and for car and transit traffic overlap, but they're not identical. The trucks kind of come in a little bit later. If you're ever driving midday on the freeway, like on I-90 or 495, which are our truck heaviest freeways, you'll see the trucks get out there about 9 o'clock, 9:30, 10 in the morning after the peak AM rush. But we also in the public sector can't dictate to freight companies what time they're going to send their trucks through. So we can design around timeshare, we can design around priority, but we don't currently, in many cases, have the capability to mandate that people be doing these deliveries off peak or sending their trucks through off peak.
Huh. Interesting. All right. Well, that's kind of sparked some other thoughts me, but I'm going to stop now because I do have some more questions and comments. But I see Laura has her hand up, so maybe I'll just stop and the chair will come back to me. I'd appreciate it. Thank you.
Laura?
Yes, I just wanted to say thank you to Sandy and others at CTPS for your work on this. This is really interesting to read, and I think you have made some progress on progressing an area of research where I have not seen a lot of focus in the past. So, congratulations on that. I think you did a good job of highlighting, some of the considerations and some of the limitations in what we know today in this. I think that's very helpful to just to understand that there is not a lot of data and that there is further research that's likely needed in this area. I would note in particular that, one thing that comes across to me in reading this is, that there is need to think more specifically about the context of particular routes, in terms of who the users are, in terms of the characteristics, thinking about what sorts of vehicles are using, the locations of bus stops, access for pedestrians and how that fits in. But also just that it doesn't seem like there has been a lot of thinking about yet in the research about what intersection design looks like. And I didn't see a ton of information about signalization in this memo. So, I think there's opportunity to continue and develop a framework here for what works where in a more general context as well. But thank you so much for your work.
Jim Fitzgerald.
Thank you. Sorry for the unmuting issue. I just want to follow up and just say thank you as well to Sandy and the rest of the CTPS staff. Certainly a topic that I think we're trying to break new ground on with regards to Summer Street. So this is a big help. Thank you.
So,
Lynn?
yeah. So it's kind of coming back to what you'd said later at the end of your answer to my question about what we can't make companies do. I guess what I'd like to see in the as you do more research is like find out the limits of find out the impact of the current limits, because if it's that the policymakers have to then tell folks or come up with laws or whatever regulations that say we need to timeshare, or we need to use smaller vehicles, then that would be good to know, so that we could work on that. Because with respect to goals, I think more like a more general goal should be sustainability. We want to make our transportation system, actually our whole society, more sustainable. First on a biological level, but then on a social level. And so we need to gear policies that will allow us to have the practices that are sustainable. So it'd be good to do the research, but then, as I said, let us know what it is that we need to implement in terms of policy in order to make things work better. And so I guess a question on the study. One of the I guess it's one of the implementations in New York, and I think the name started with a J, and it indicated there was like a 50% increase in flow, but then it dropped off. Any indication of why it dropped off? I think it was like J
Street, probably in Brooklyn. Yeah. I don't know off the top of my head. I think often there's a rush of enforcement when something changes or opens, and then it drops off a little bit, or people get used to it. I think there's also been a lot of tension in New York City from what I have read and heard and talked to people about law enforcement and their relative interest in enforcing traffic laws. I can't say anything categorical about that because I don't know.
That's fine. That's fine. And I'll go back and try to read some of the studies that you went to. And as I said, I think it'd be interesting to see what we could do with smaller delivery vehicles. I know, it's not as efficient, but once again, if the priority is sustainability, we might just have to change, some of our practices. And also, I'm interested in whether or not there are any cases that you may have a chance to look at later, that will involve bike lanes, because we do have a lot of bike lanes here. It wasn't clear to me if any of these studies had to deal with that. Do you know?
So the one tidbit I can offer about that is from Portland, where they actually mentioned that because the transit lane there involves not just buses, but the Portland streetcar, that cyclists avoid that lane because of the streetcar rails. That those can often send people spinning sideways or getting stuck in the rut. It's a question that came up several times in this research. I believe, and somebody from the city or MBTA, please correct me if I'm wrong on this, I believe there's going to be bike lanes on Summer Street as well, or at least that's under consideration. But I think the general kind of principle that I have gleaned from this is that people do not want bikes sharing lanes with trucks and buses both. Like in Boston now we have some bus and bike lanes, and I think many cyclists have mixed feelings about that, but having both the trucks and the buses is just maybe, and then having the people on bikes also would be a little bit over the top.
Tim Fitzgerald.
Yeah, I just wanted to confirm what Sandy just said about Summer Street. The intention there is to have separate bike accommodations, separate from the shared bus truck lane.
Thank you, Jim.
And the very last comment, and that is on, I think you may put it in for me, Sandy, the reference to autonomous freight and buses by Ed Carr, and this letter from 2022. So that was inspiring. So thank you. Great report once again. Appreciate it.
Tom Bent.
Thank you, Sandy. Thank you very much. I thought this was very, very interesting study. And as Laura said, I'd be interested to see more detail because the devil's always in the details with these things. But one of the big complaints that I hear, we may have these very long stretches of dedicated bus lanes. And then you have, one lane of traffic where before you had two lanes of vehicles, right? And so it'll be locked, bumper to bumper, and people will be sitting there for 20, 25 minutes trying to get through a light or, get down a main street. Meanwhile, no buses are going by at all. And so, I find this interesting where if the buses and trucks could share those lanes, how much would that alleviate traffic and things like that, vehicle traffic. So I found this very, very, very interesting. And thank you for doing that, and look forward to seeing some more detail on it.
Any other questions, comments? Seeing none. Thank you, Sandy. I believe we're now up to member items. Is there any members of the MPO who have any items they'd like to bring before? Seeing none, can I get a motion and a second to adjourn? Wait, Eric Barassa. I'm sorry.
I was going to make a motion to adjourn.
Excellent. Tom Bent.
I'll second that motion.
Motion has been made and seconded. Without objection, we are adjourned. I'll see everybody in 2 weeks. Thanks, guys. Bye, everybody.
Thank you. Happy holidays.